Welcome to Stories Junction. Let's begin today's story. My name is Daniel, and let me tell you, this is one of those twists of fate you never see barreling toward you until it's too late. I never thought I'd end up staring my ex-wife in the face again. Not after the way our marriage crashed and burned, not after the deceit, the bitter divorce, and the chaos that swallowed everything I once held dear. But here I am, standing in a polished office in my finest suit, watching her go pale as the realization hits her like a freight train. The kicker? She's trapped in this with me, no escape hatch in sight. I know what you're thinking. How did I land in this mess? What chain of events brought me here? And most importantly, what's my next move? Trust me, this is a tale you'll want to hear from start to finish. If I weren't living it, I'd swear it was fiction. So, buckle up. I'm taking you back to the beginning. Years ago, I thought I'd struck gold. Her name was Elise, and back then, I was convinced she was the woman I'd grow old with, the missing piece I'd been searching for. You know that feeling when you meet someone and the world just aligns? That was us. We crossed paths at a co-worker's barbecue in Portland, a casual Saturday affair I nearly skipped. The sky was dumping rain, and I was perfectly content to stay home with a cold beer and some mindless TV. But my buddy Jake wouldn't let it go. He practically dragged me out the door, promising it'd be worth it. Looking back, I can't help but wonder how my life might have unfolded if I'd stayed on that couch. Instead, I showed up, soggy and reluctant, and there she was, Elise, standing under a canopy strung with fairy lights, her laugh cutting through the drizzle. I don't know what it was about her, but I couldn't look away. So, I manned up, walked over, and introduced myself. From that first handshake, we were inseparable. We talked for hours that night, oblivious to the crowd thinning out around us. It was effortless, two strangers who felt like old friends. She had this way of listening, really listening, that made me feel seen. By the time the stars peeked through the clouds, I knew I'd met someone special. We started dating a week later, and those early days were some of the brightest I've ever known. Elise was everything I'd hoped for. Supportive, sharp, with a dry humor that kept me on my toes. I was working as a software developer for a mid-sized firm in Seattle then, a job I'd snagged right out of grad school. It wasn't my dream, coding endless lines for someone else's vision, but it paid well, and I was good at it. Elise, on the other hand, had a steady gig with the city council, managing permits and projects. It came with decent benefits and a predictable schedule. Together, we carved out a solid life. Nothing flashy, but comfortable, stable, and, I thought, happy. After 2 years of dating, I knew she was it for me. Proposing wasn't even a question. It felt like the next step in a story already written. I planned it out carefully, a weekend hike in the Cascade Mountains, just the two of us. At the top of a ridge, with the wind whipping around us and the valley sprawling below, I dropped to one knee. She said yes before I'd even finished the question, her eyes shining with something I took for certainty. That moment, I felt like my life had locked in a place, like every choice I'd made had led me right there. Our wedding came a year later, a perfect day in a rustic barn outside Tacoma. Friends and family packed the place, toasting us with cheap wine and heartfelt speeches. We stood up there, hands clasped, promising to weather anything together, sickness, health, the whole deal. I believed it with every fiber of my being. From the outside, we had it all. Decent careers, a cozy apartment with a view of the Sound, and a marriage I thought was built to last. But life has a way of teaching you that what looks solid can crumble faster than you'd ever expect. A few years in, though, I started to itch. My job was fine, better than fine, really, but it wasn't enough. I'd always had ideas, half-formed dreams of creating something that could change things, leave a mark. The thought of grinding away in a cubicle for the next 30 years started to feel like a slow chokehold. I wanted more, not just a paycheck, but purpose. So, after months of wrestling with it, I made up my mind. I'd quit and start my own company. This wasn't some reckless leap into the void. I'd been smart about it. I'd socked away a hefty chunk of savings, sketched out a business plan, and spent late nights researching the market. I wasn't naive enough to think it'd be easy, but I figured I had a shot. One night, over takeout in our cramped kitchen, I laid it all out for Elise. I told her about my idea, a platform to streamline project management for small businesses, how I'd been dreaming it up for years, and how I couldn't keep putting it off. She listened quietly, chopsticks paused midair, then smiled. I believe in you, Dan, she said. We'll figure it out together. Her words lit me up. I thought, this is what partnership looks like. Someone who's got your back, even when the road's uncertain. But building a business isn't the glossy montage you see in movies. It's not just late nights and coffee-fueled breakthroughs. It's failure after failure, plans that unravel, and moments where you wonder if you've torched your life for nothing. The first few months were a slog. I'd hole up in our spare room, hunched over my laptop, trying to turn my vision into something real. But every prototype crashed, every pitch fell flat. The savings I'd banked on started bleeding out, server costs, software licenses, marketing that went nowhere. I kept telling myself it'd turn around, that I just needed one break. Meanwhile, I could feel the distance growing between me and Elise. Back when I had a regular gig, we had routines, dinner at the table, binge-watching shows, weekend drives up the coast. Now, I was a ghost in my own home, too buried in work to notice how quiet the apartment had gotten. I didn't mean to shut her out. I thought she got it, that she saw this as a rough patch we'd push through together. I'd catch up with her later, I told myself, once the company was on its feet. One evening, after a brutal day of debugging code that refused to cooperate, I slumped onto the couch next to her. It's not clicking yet, I said, rubbing my temples. I need to double down, put in more hours. She looked at me, her face soft but unreadable, and nodded. I know this matters to you, Dan. I'm here. I grabbed onto that like a lifeline, convinced she meant it. I didn't see the storm brewing, not yet. Nothing in the world can brace you for the gut punch of finding out the person you'd bet your life on has been playing you for a fool. That reckoning was closer than I knew, and it'd change everything. The unraveling came fast, like a thread pulled loose that brings the whole sweater apart. I've been so consumed by my startup, chasing deadlines, tweaking code, begging for meetings that I didn't see the signs. Elise and I had been married for 4 years by then, and I thought we were solid, even with the strain of my new venture. I figured she understood the long hours, the missed dinners, the way I'd collapse into bed too exhausted to talk. I'd built this image in my head of us as a team, her cheering me on from the sidelines while I fought to make something of myself. But that image was a house of cards, and it only took one gust to knock it down. It was a Tuesday, gray, unremarkable, the kind of day that blends into the Seattle haze. I just come off a brutal pitch to a potential investor who'd barely let me finish before waving me off. My savings were down to fumes, and the pressure was a vice around my chest. I stopped for coffee on the way home, needing a minute to breathe when my phone buzzed. It was Mark, a guy I'd known since college who worked in the same city council office as Elise. We weren't close, but we'd grab beers now and then, swap stories about the grind. His text was short. Hey man, you free to meet? Need to talk. I figured you wanted to vent about work or ask for tech advice. Nothing unusual. I texted back, sure, where? Half an hour later, we were sitting in a dim corner of a dive bar near Pioneer Square, the kind of place where the jukebox hums and no one asks questions. Mark looked uneasy, nursing his pint like it was a shield. Dan, he started, voice low. I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to come out with it. You need to know something about Elise. My stomach did a slow flip, but I kept my face neutral. What about her? I asked, leaning back in the booth. He hesitated, eyes darting to the table, then met my gaze. She's been seeing someone. It's not just talk. I've seen it myself. A guy from her department. They've been meeting up after hours, and it's been going on a while. For a second, my brain stalled, like a computer hitting a fatal error, refusing to process. I almost laughed. It sounded so absurd. Elise? My Elise? But Mark wasn't laughing. He pulled out his phone, slid it across the table, and there it was, a photo, grainy but unmistakable. Elise and some guy I didn't recognize, standing too close outside a restaurant, her hand on his arm, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. I stared at it, the noise of the bar fading to a dull roar in my ears. Who is he? I managed, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. His name's Ryan, Mark said, mid-level planner. Started about a year ago. I didn't want to believe it either, but it's not a one-off. People at work have noticed they've been sloppy about hiding it. He kept talking dates, times, little details that piled up like bricks, but I was barely listening. My mind was racing back through the last year. Her late nights at the office, the way she'd started locking her phone, how she'd brush off my questions with a tight smile. I chalked it up to stress, to me being distracted. How'd I miss this? I didn't thank Mark or say much else. I left cash on the table, walked out into the drizzle, and drove home in a daze. Elise was there when I got in, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through her tablet like it was any other night. Seeing her so calm, so normal, lit something ugly in me. I didn't sit down, didn't take off my coat. I just stood there, staring at her until she looked up, eyebrows knitting. "Dan, you okay?" she asked, setting the glass down. I didn't ease into it. "Who's Ryan?" Her face froze, eyes wide, lips parted, like a deer caught in headlights. That was all I needed, but I pressed anyway. "Tell me, right now, who is he?" Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, until she finally spoke, her voice small. "He's just a coworker." "It's not." "Don't." I cut her off, sharper than I meant to. "Don't lie to me." "I know." She flinched, and then the dam broke. She didn't deny it, just sat there, hands twisting in her lap, and let it spill out. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "It just did. You were always working, Dan. I was lonely. I didn't know how to tell you." Lonely. The word hit me like a slap. I'd been killing myself to build something for us, and she'd turned it into an excuse. "How long?" I asked, my throat tight. 6 months, she whispered. 6 months. Half a year of lies while I'd been pouring my soul into a dream she'd pretended to support. I don't remember everything I said after that. My voice rose, words tumbling out in a mess of anger and hurt. "Did you ever think about what this would do to me? Did you even care?" She just sat there, tears streaking her face, mumbling apologies that sounded hollow. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my keys and walked out, the rain soaking through my jacket as I drove aimlessly through the city. That night, I crashed at Jake's place, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment I'd missed. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the way she'd let me believe we were still a team, all while she checked out. The divorce was a war. I thought we could keep it civil, split things down the middle, and move on. I was wrong. Elise didn't just want out. She wanted to bury me. She hired a shark of a lawyer and came after everything. My savings, the equity in our apartment, even the scraps of my startup's budget. She painted me as the deadbeat dreamer who'd abandoned her, twisting the story to make herself the victim. I'd been out of work for months by then, my business still a sinking ship, while she had her steady city paycheck. She thought she could bleed me dry and walk away clean. But here's the twist. She overestimated what was left to take. My savings were nearly gone, eaten up by the startup, and the apartment was underwater from a bad refinance. She fought dirty, but there was no prize to claim. In the end, she got a pittance, some furniture, a chunk of my 401k, and stormed off, thinking she'd left me broken. She was wrong about that, too. Those first months after the papers were signed were hell, I won't lie. Finding out Elise had cheated didn't just hurt, it cracked something fundamental in me. I questioned everything. Our years together, my ability to read people, my own worth. I'd wake up in a cheap rental, staring at bare walls, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole she'd helped dig. But I had a choice, let it destroy me or fight back. I picked the latter. With nothing left to lose, I threw myself into my startup like a man possessed. It was all I had, the one thing she couldn't touch. I worked until my eyes burned, refining the platform, cold calling anyone who'd listen. Money was tight. I lived off ramen and stubbornness, but I kept going. Elise thought she'd left me with nothing. She didn't see what was coming. After the divorce, I was a man on the edge, teetering between collapse and something fiercer. Elise had walked away, thinking she'd stripped me bare, left me to rot in the ashes of our life together. She didn't get the payout she'd hoped for, but she'd still taken a sledgehammer to my world. Those first few months were a blur of survival. I'd moved into a cramped studio in a sketchy part of Seattle, The kind of place where the walls thrummed with neighbors' arguments and the heat cut out half the time. My startup was my lifeline, the only thing keeping me from drowning in the wreckage. I'd lost my wife, my home, most of my savings, but I still had this one stubborn dream, and I clung to it like a raft in a storm. I worked like a madman. Days bled into nights, my laptop glowing in the dim apartment as I rewrote code, redesigned features, and chased leads. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. 3 hours here, a nap there, fueled by cheap coffee and cheaper takeout. The platform I'd been building, a tool to streamline workflows for small businesses, was rough but promising. I'd pitch it to anyone who'd listen: startup incubators, local entrepreneurs, even random contacts I'd cold email at 2 a.m. Most doors slammed shut. Interesting, but not for us, they'd say, or worse, they'd ghost me entirely. Every rejection stung, piling onto the doubt Elise had left festering in me. Was this idea even good? Had I tanked my life for a pipe dream? I'd lie awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, wrestling with that fear. But giving up wasn't an option. She'd taken enough from me already. Money was the real chokehold. My savings were a ghost of what they'd been, and I had no steady income to replenish them. I'd cut corners where I could, skipping meals, dodging bills, but the clock was ticking. I needed a win, something to prove I hadn't bet everything on a losing hand. I started broadening my net, pitching to bigger players, companies with deeper pockets. I'd polish my presentation until it gleamed, practicing in front of a cracked bathroom mirror, trying to sound like a man who had it together. Most didn't bite. Some would hear me out, nod thoughtfully, then send a polite no thanks email days later. The rejections wore me down, but I kept swinging. I had to. There was nothing else left. Then, just as I was scraping the bottom, a break came. I'd pitched to a firm called Nexus Solutions, a mid-sized outfit based in Bellevue that specialized in tech for logistics. I'd stumbled across their name in an industry newsletter, saw they were hunting for innovative tools, and fired off a Hail Mary email. To my shock, they replied, invited me in for a meeting. I showed up in my one decent suit, patched together with nerves and caffeine, and gave it everything. The room was all glass and steel, a dozen execs in crisp shirts staring me down. I walked them through the platform, how it could cut their project timelines, boost efficiency, save them cash. They asked hard questions, poked holes I hadn't seen, but I held my ground. When I finished, the room went quiet. Then the VP, a guy named Carter with a handshake like a vice, said, "We'll be in touch." I left feeling like I'd run a marathon, unsure if I'd crossed the line or tripped to the start. A week later, they called. They didn't just want to license the platform. They wanted a partner. Nexus saw potential where others hadn't, and they were ready to back me. The deal wasn't just money. It was validation, a lifeline when I'd been one step from sinking. They offered funding, resources, a cut of the profits if it took off. I signed the papers in a daze, barely believing it was real. Within weeks, I had an office, not some dingy rental, but a proper space with a view of Lake Washington. The cash flow started, slow at first, then steady. I hired a small team, coders, a designer, a sales guy who talked faster than I could think. 6 months in, the platform launched, and it worked. Clients signed on, numbers climbed, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground solidify beneath me. The turnaround was surreal. I went from a guy scraping by on fumes to someone with a seat at the table. Nexus didn't just fund me, they gave me influence. I wasn't just the tech guy anymore. I had a say in strategy, hiring, the whole operation. My name started popping up in industry circles. Daniel Hayes, the scrappy founder who'd pulled off a long shot. I traded the studio for a condo downtown. Nothing fancy, but a hell of a step up. I'd catch my reflection in the elevator sometimes, clean-shaven, sharp jacket, and barely recognize myself. Elise had bet I'd crash and burn, but I clawed my way out. I wasn't just surviving, I was winning. Then fate tossed me a wild card. Nexus was expanding, adding staff to the departments I oversaw. Hiring was routine. HR sifted resumes. I'd sign off on the final picks. I didn't micromanage it. I trusted the team to find talent. One morning, I was in my office, coffee in hand, skimming the latest batch of new hires. The list was standard: names, roles, start dates, until I hit one that stopped me cold. Elise Morgan. I blinked, reread it, thinking it had to be a glitch. But there it was, her name in black and white, my ex-wife slotted into a project manager role under my chain of command. I leaned back, the chair creaking, and let it sink in. Of all the companies in the Pacific Northwest, of all the jobs she could have chased, she'd landed here. I pulled up her file, curiosity overriding shock. She'd left the city council gig. No surprise there. It was stable but stagnant, and Elise always had an eye for more. Her resume showed a stint at a private firm. Then this jump to Nexus. Better pay, a step up the ladder. She'd clearly been hunting for a bigger paycheck, a cushier life. She had no idea I was part of this. That much was obvious. Had she even checked who ran the department? Or had she just fired off applications, blind to where they'd land? Either way, the ink was dry. She was in. I sat there, staring at her name, a slow grin tugging at my mouth. The irony was delicious, thick enough to choke on. Her first day was a week away. I spent it plotting, not out of spite, not yet, but to make sure I owned the moment. I picked my best suit, a charcoal number I'd splurged on after the Nexus deal, paired it with polished shoes, a silk tie, a watch that caught the light just right. I even dabbed on cologne, something woodsy and sharp. Not for her, but for me. I wanted to walk in radiating control, a man she couldn't ignore. When the day came, I strode into the conference room where the new hires were gathered, a dozen fresh faces waiting to meet their lead. I didn't have to hunt for her. She was third from the left, hair pulled back, notepad in hand. Our eyes locked, and her face went white, like she'd seen a ghost. I didn't flinch, didn't smile, just kept my pace steady as I took the front of the room. "Good morning," I said, voice calm and firm, addressing the group. "I'm Daniel Hayes, and I'll be overseeing your work here." I laid out the gig, expectations, goals, the kind of hustle Nexus demanded, making eye contact with each of them, one by one. Elise got the same glance as the rest, nothing more. I could see her squirming, fingers tightening on her pen, but I didn't acknowledge it. She was just another hire, another cog in the machine I'd built. Inside, though, I felt the weight of it, her shock, her sudden smallness. This was my turf now, and she'd walked right into it. The air in that conference room hung heavy after I finished my spiel. The new hires nodded, scribbled notes, and filed out, but Elise lingered, her movements slow, like she was testing the ground beneath her. I didn't wait around, kept my stride deliberate as I headed back to my office, the click of my shoes echoing off the polished floor. I'd barely settled into my chair, the door still ajar, when I heard a knock. I knew it was her before I looked up. Elise never could sit with discomfort. She'd always try to smooth it over, regain her footing. She stood in the doorway, posture stiff, like a kid caught sneaking in late. "Dan," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years, "can I talk to you for a minute?" I didn't stand, just crossed my arms and leaned back. "Go ahead." She stepped in, shutting the door behind her with a quiet click. Up close, she looked different. Older, sure, but also uncertain, a far cry from the woman who'd once torn through my life like a storm. She took a shaky breath, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. I didn't know you'd be here," she started. "I swear, I didn't plan this." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, letting her fill the silence. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For what I did back then, how I hurt you. I know it's late, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but please, Dan, don't hold it against me here. This job, it's everything I've been working toward. I can't lose it." Her eyes dropped to the floor, voice trembling. "Please." I let her words hang there, studying her. The apology sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in the mirror, but the fear in her eyes was real. I could feel it rolling off her. Guilt, maybe, or just desperation. I nodded once, keeping my face blank. "Focus on your work," I said, clipped and final. She blinked, opened her mouth like she wanted to say more, then thought better of it. With a quick "thank you," she slipped out, leaving the room quieter than before. I sat there, turning it over in my head. She'd come to me, hat in hand, begging for mercy. The same woman who'd lied to my face, who'd tried to gut me in the divorce, now needed me to play nice. It was almost too perfect. From that day, I watched her shift. In meetings, she was a ghost of herself, soft-spoken, overly polite, always treading carefully. She'd nod to my every word, throw in a great point, Dan, when I spoke, like she was auditioning for my approval. Her emails were formal to a fault. Every line double-checked for anything that might set me off. I couldn't tell if it was remorse or self-preservation, maybe both. She'd sit across from me at the conference table, eyes darting my way, then away, like she was waiting for the axe to fall. I didn't give her anything, no warmth, no hostility, just cold professionalism. She'd made her bed years ago. I wasn't here to tuck her in. Work rolled on, and I kept my focus sharp. The Nexus partnership was thriving. Our platform was picking up steam, clients piling in from across the coast. My days were packed. Strategy sessions, investor calls, late nights, tweaking the roadmap. I'd built something real, something Elise had never believed in, and now she was a cog in it. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd left her city job for this, chasing a bigger title, a fatter check, probably the kind of life she'd wanted with that Ryan guy, whoever he was now. She hadn't seen me coming, hadn't counted on me rising from the dirt she'd kicked over me. And here we were, me at the helm, her scrambling to keep up. I catch myself watching her sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. She was good at her job, I'd give her that. Organized, quick with solutions, the kind of hire HR loved. But there was a brittleness to her, a crack in the confidence she used to wear like armor. One afternoon, we were in a briefing, me, her, a handful of others, going over a client rollout. I threw out a question about timelines, nothing tricky, just testing the room. She jumped in, voice steady but hands fidgeting under the table. "We can push it to Q3 if we shift resources here," she said, sliding a chart across. I nodded, said, "Fine, make it happen," and moved on. She exhaled, barely audible, like she'd dodged a bullet. It was small, but I saw it. The way she shrank under my shadow. Part of me liked it, I won't lie. Seeing her squirm, knowing her career hung on my say-so, it felt like justice, a quiet payback for the nights I'd spent wondering how I'd failed her. But it wasn't enough to settle the score. I'd think back to the divorce, to the way she'd twisted the knife. She hadn't just cheated, she tried to erase me. Her lawyer had painted me as the reckless fool who'd left her stranded, demanding every dime she could squeeze out. If she'd had her way, I'd have been bankrupt, my startup dead before it breathed. She'd wanted me to fail, to prove she'd been right to walk away. Now, here she was, starting over while I held the reins. The power shift was stark, and it stirred something in me, something dark but also conflicted. I could make her life hell if I wanted. It'd be easy, stack her with impossible deadlines, nitpick her work until she cracked, or dig up some flimsy excuse to cut her loose. HR would back me. I had the clout now. I'd imagine it sometimes, late at night, when the office was empty and the city lights blinked outside my window. I could call her in, drop a stack of revisions on her desk, watch her scramble to keep up. Or I could go colder, ignore her entirely, let her twist in the uncertainty of where she stood. She'd handed me the tools to ruin her, the same way she'd tried to ruin me. All it'd take was a word, a signature, and she'd be out the door, her dream job gone. But then I'd pause. What was the point? She'd already lost the war. She just didn't know it. I'd built this life, this success, from the rubble she'd left behind. She had to clock in every day, sit in my meetings, answer to the man she'd underestimated. Wasn't that enough? I'd think about her walking out of our marriage, so sure I'd never recover, and now here I was, thriving while she played catch-up. Revenge felt tempting, but maybe living well was the sharper blade. I'd wrestle with it, flipping between the urge to strike and the thought of letting her stew in her own defeat. It was a tightrope, and I hadn't picked a side. One day, she overstepped. Nothing big, just a slip. We were in a team huddle, brainstorming a pitch, and she cut in mid-sentence, suggesting a tweak to my plan. Maybe if we adjust the rollout here, it'd save time, she said, too casual, like we were equals. The room went quiet, eyes flicking to me. I let it sit for a beat, then said, "Noted. We'll stick with the original." My tone was ice, and she shrank back, cheeks flushing. Later, she emailed an apology, short, formal, dripping with nerves. I didn't reply. It wasn't about the idea. It was the reminder. She wasn't in control here. I was. And that moment crystallized it. I held her fate, and she knew it. So here I am, months into this strange new reality, sitting in my office with a view of the Seattle skyline, reflecting on how the tables have turned. Elise is still here, still clocking in every day, still navigating the tightrope of working under me. I've got her career in my hands, her dream job, her fresh start, and the weight of that power hasn't gotten old. I catch myself thinking about it more than I should, replaying the past, weighing my options. She betrayed me, tried to bury me, and now she's the one looking up, hoping I don't pull the rug out. It's a hell of a twist, and I'm stuck in the middle of it, torn between two paths. Let her off the hook or make her pay. I think back to those dark days after the divorce, when I was scraping by in that dingy studio, wondering if I'd ever get my footing back. Elise didn't just walk out. She swung for the fences, trying to take everything I had left. Her lawyer's letters were relentless, demanding my savings, my stake in the apartment, anything she could claw away. She'd painted me as the failure, the guy who'd chased a stupid dream and left her high and dry. If she'd gotten her way, my startup would have been a footnote, dead before it had a pulse. I'd have been starting from zero, broke and broken, while she moved on with her new life, her new guy. She didn't just want out. She wanted me to crash and burn, to prove I'd never amount to anything without her. That stings deeper than the affair itself, the way she bet against me and smiled while she did it. Now the script's flipped. I'm the one with the corner office, the one calling shots at Nexus, while she's the underling scrambling to prove her worth. She shows up early, stays late, turns in flawless reports, like she's auditioning for a second chance she doesn't deserve. I see it in her eyes every meeting, that flicker of unease when I speak, like she's waiting for me to drop the hammer. I could too. It'd be simple. Overload her with work, set deadlines she can't meet, or just cut her loose with some vague, not a fit excuse. HR wouldn't blink. I've got the pull now. I'd picture it sometimes, late at night when the office was still, her packing up her desk, tail between her legs, knowing I'd won. The thought lights something in me, a spark of satisfaction, maybe even spite. She didn't show me mercy when she had the chance. Why should I? But then there's the other side, the quieter voice that creeps in when I'm not stewing. I've already won, haven't I? I built this, Nexus, the platform, the life, out of the mess she left behind. She thought I'd fold, but I didn't. I'm standing taller now than I ever did with her, and she's the one playing catch-up. Every day she walks in here, she's reminded of it. The man she wrote off is the one she answers to. That's a punishment she can't outrun, no firing required. I catch her in the break room sometimes, pouring coffee with that same brittle edge, and wonder if she's replaying it too. How she misjudged me, how she lost the bet. Maybe that's enough. Maybe letting her live with that, day in and day out, cuts deeper than anything I could orchestrate. I tested it once just to see. We were in a strategy session, me at the head of the table, her jotting notes like her life depended on it. I threw out a curveball, assigned her a high-stakes project, tight deadline, no warning. "Elise, you're on this," I said, voice flat, eyes on my papers. The room didn't notice, but I saw her freeze, pen hovering, before she nodded. "Got it, Dan." She pulled it off, flawless, ahead of schedule, like she'd been training for it. Afterward, she emailed a status update, polite to a fault, with a "let me know if there's anything else" tacked on. I didn't reply, just filed it away. She's good. I'll give her that. Better than I remembered. But she's still on edge, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't push harder, didn't need to. The point was made. It's been a year since she started, and I still haven't settled it in my head. Some days, I lean toward letting it go, keeping her on, treating her like any other hire, letting the past fade. She's earning her keep, pulling her weight, and I've got bigger fish to fry. New clients, a second product launch, a team that's doubling. Why waste energy on her when I've already come out on top? But then I'll remember her voice that night I confronted her, I was lonely, Dan, and the way she turned it on me, like I'd forced her hand. I'll think of the divorce papers, the smug look on her lawyer's face, and that old anger flares up. If the roles were reversed, would she have let me off easy? Hell no. She'd have crushed me without a second thought. Walked away laughing. Knowing that, it's hard to let it lie. One morning, it hit me square. I was in my office, prepping for a board meeting, when she knocked, tentative like always. Dan, can I run something by you? She asked, holding a tablet with some client data. I waved her in, listened as she laid out her pitch, sharp, concise, better than half the ideas floating around. I nodded, said, good. Move on it. She hesitated, then smiled. A small, real one, not the nervous kind. Thanks, she said and left. I sat there, staring at the door, feeling the tug of it. She's trying, really trying, and part of me respects that. But respect doesn't erase history. It doesn't undo the nights I spent doubting myself because of her. So here's where I land, and I'm still not sure it's solid ground. I could fire her tomorrow, make her regret ever crossing me, and sleep fine knowing she got what she gave. Or I could keep her here, let her build something under my watch, and call it even, not forgiveness, but a truce. The first feels like justice. The second feels like power. I've got the upper hand either way. She's not walking out of this unscathed. If I cut her loose, she'll scramble for another gig, always wondering what she could have had. If I keep her, she'll stay in my orbit, answering to me, living with the weight of what she did. Both sting for her, both work for me. I don't know what I'll do, not yet. It's a coin toss, and I'm still flipping in my head. Maybe I'll wake up one day and decide she's had enough. Let her keep climbing while I focus on what's next. Or maybe I'll call her in, hand her a pink slip, and watch her world tilt, just because I can. For now, I'm sitting on it, letting her sweat, letting the past simmer. Her fate's mine to call, and that's a win she can't take back. What do you think? Should I bury the hatchet and let her stay, or remind her what happens when you burn a bridge with me? I'm all ears.